It is a distinct honor and pleasure to be here today to give you a slice of my life that took place in the 1960s. And I was very fortunate to be a part of this movement because my parents had a very big part to play in it. And at the time, I was a very young tot. I was about 6 years old when all of this happened. And it was an honor for me to be on the coattails of my parents because they had the courage to bring me out there to see it with my own eyes from the very beginning when it started to the very end. So today I want to talk about this from a personal perspective, from the eyes of a child. I don't want to give you a history lesson because I'm pretty sure you've been inundated with history from the time you were 6 years old. So what I want to do is focus more on, like, how did I see this? How did other people see this? And also what I want you to get out of this is this particular journey is a journey which is similar to other journeys that have happened to people from the beginning of time. There's always been injustice, and there's always been justice. And what I want the youth to understand is this is not stuck in time. You're going to face instances like this from now on, and it's going to be up to you to see justice through your own eyes. I would like to know how many people in the room are students here at CMC right now. Raise your hands. Okay, that's great to see. All right. And how many of you guys are in your 30s and 40s? Wow, I see some young faces out there. Whoa. How many guys are in your 40s and 50s? Now, wait now. Oh, you're multi-age though. Okay, good. And how many people are like me in their 50s and beyond? All right. So some of you kind of saw this from your couches, you saw it on television, but basically this particular movement, the Albany movement, was less, I would say, it had less notoriety than some of the other movements. You've heard of the Birmingham movement, you heard about the one in Montgomery. This one was lesser known, and I'll tell you why. The reason this was lesser known is because the Albany movement, in the eyes of the historians, failed. They were not able to pull it off, even with the help of MLK. MLK actually came and stayed in our home. He actually stayed in our home, and I saw him plot the whole movement in our backyard. But he was not able to win this particular fight because there was a very smart policeman there. The police chief named Laurie Pritchett was able to fight nonviolence with nonviolence. He was one of the smartest cops in the United States. And you'll learn more about that. Now, so let me just say, let me move forward with this, because I know you guys, see, kind of, I'm technically challenged.
Yeah.
It's not happening.
There you go. You're good.
Oh, it did happen. Okay. So just looking at this, just think about this particular movement. What does segregation do to the soul of a child? And so just look at that image, and this is what I saw every day. When I was 6 years old, everything was segregated. Everywhere you went, from water fountains, swimming pools, libraries, educational institutions, even a sitting room in a hospital, you were always in a different spot. Don't dare go to a white neighborhood unless you want to cut somebody's lawn or you're going to take care of somebody's baby. You were not supposed to be seen there. The idea was to keep the races separated, and it wasn't about, okay, these are evil people. It was about, this is what my grandfather did and my great-grandfather did, and we're just going to uphold these customs, and we think this is the way it's going to go. And so it was more or less, can you see justice or can't you see justice? You know, with the Civil War. The Civil War came to an end because there were some very, very upright white people that said this is wrong. They joined the abolitionist movement and they put slavery to an end. So it was all about justice. But you know something, most times it's like that. You got that 5% or that 10% who really are able to see it and they move on it, right? And you have that 80% who kind of like say, you know, it's wrong, but I don't want to get involved because I might lose something. I might lose my job, I'm going to lose my status, I'm going to lose my this and that and the other. So this is what this particular movement was about. Now, what am I doing wrong? Double tap. Okay. Still not working.
It's the calibration of the screen.
Yeah, the screen is off. Tap in the open area on the screen.
Not in the box above it. Go above it. No.
Here?
Right here.
Who would have thought?
So in looking at this situation, this is a very iconic picture of the movement. My father's right here, and they are out praying in front of the police station. This movement became the epicenter of the civil rights movement in terms of what they were trying to do to end segregation.
Twice.
Okay, there I go. Now, one of the books that does a really good job in chronicling this movement is a book called Parting the Waters. This was actually written by Taylor Branch, and he talked about the King years, starting from 1954 to 63. And if you want to get a bigger slice of what happened in the Albany movement, this is an excellent book to look at. Okay, how many people know anything about Albany?
Georgia.
You know it's in Georgia. I want to make sure we're all on the same page here because there are like 3 or 4 Albanys out there. There's one in New York, and that's where Albany got its name from. There's one in California. Oakland. Okay? So they're all over the place. But I want to make sure that we're on the same page. So you're not thinking about sandy beaches or everything about snowy places. We're talking about this really hot place down deep in the south. And so if you know anything about Albany, it's an agricultural powerhouse. It's known for its peaches, it's known for its pecans, and its cotton. And I'm telling you right now, if you haven't had a Georgia peach, you haven't had a peach. If you haven't had a Georgia pecan in your chocolate, you have not had a real pecan. So that's just something that you need to be aware of. Now, I want to put us on the map, because a lot of people, you don't know that much about Albany. Who was one of the most famous people that came out of Albany? He's right there on that piano. Ray Charles. So Ray Charles kind of like put us on the map in terms of, you know, what he did with music. I just want to give you a little perspective about Albany so that you understand the context of how all of this came about. Albany, before whites came, was totally inhabited by the Creek Indians. Okay, they were the folks who were there. It was a place where they lived their lives in peace. But when the whites came, a lot of stuff happened, and eventually they were actually relocated. Interestingly enough, I am a Creek. I don't look like a Creek, but my great-grandfather was a Creek Indian, okay? And interestingly enough, when it was time to ship the Indians out on the other side of the Mississippi, he decided not to go. I think one of the reasons he decided not to go was that his wife was an African-American. And so the idea was she didn't want to go to this reservation and just be totally forgotten about and be cut off from her family. So he stayed behind, and by him staying behind as a Creek Indian, he became persona non grata. Because if you were Indian and you were left behind, you were not recognized. So my grandfather was half Creek, and that stayed kind of like in our culture. I don't know that much about my ethnicity, but I can say that the Creek Indian culture was very big in this part of Georgia. Now, after around 1830, a man by the name of Mr. Tiff came from Connecticut, and Tiff set up this settlement. And pretty soon, what they did was they began to plant all along this river called the Flint River, and it was a place where a lot of agriculture was done, primarily cotton and the pecans and other crops, and it began to thrive. The majority of the population at that time were African Americans. About 70% of them were enslaved, and they were the ones who did most of the work in developing these crops. Now, we know about the Civil War. Civil War comes to an end, and before the Civil War ended, 3 amendments were passed. The 13th Amendment basically ended slavery. The 14th Amendment basically gave African American citizenship, and the 15th Amendment gave blacks the right to vote. Okay? So this was a very heady time for African Americans. Just imagine, you've been enslaved for 300 years, and all of a sudden, with the swoop of this wand, you're now given all this freedom. It must have been an amazing feeling. And on top of that, guess what they were promised? They were promised 40 acres and a mule. My God. That's something that I don't think anybody believed that could happen. And so you had a lot of African Americans thinking that they were going to have their own farms, they're going to have all of this peace, and it was just going to be tranquility for the rest of their lives. But this promise of equality and this promise of suffrage soon came to an end. Can anybody tell me why?
Jim Crow.
Jim Crow. Jim Crow, very good answer there. There was something called Reconstruction. The Reconstruction period was a time where the North was supposed to come into the South heavy-handed, and we're going to basically implement those 3 amendments. We're going to ensure that blacks get their rights. We're going to ensure they have a right to vote. But it only lasted for a certain period of time. By 1876, things went south, there was a deal made, and the Reconstruction period came to an end. The Northerners went back to the North, the Southerners took over, and I'm telling you, all hell broke loose. Now, this man, Ulysses Grant, he did his best. Good man. He was a soldier. He wanted to uphold what Lincoln had started. He did his best to go down there and enforce those acts. He tried to deal with the Ku Klux Klan, who were very horrible terrorizers, but it all failed. So we moved into another era, and this was the era of Jim Crow, as my scholar back there said. And the era of Jim Crow was, we're going to separate everything. We don't want to mingle with blacks, and we don't think that blacks should mingle with us, and those particular, what can I say, feelings existed for a number of years. And there was also systematic exploitation in terms of African Americans did not and could not work in any companies at that time. Even when I was a boy, you couldn't work for IBM. You couldn't work for any of those companies. The highest thing that you could do as an African American male was to work for the Postal Service as a postman. That was the highest job you could attain. If you really wanted status in the African American community, what could you do besides that? What other? Funeral home was good, but a lot of folks didn't like to deal with dead people. Minister was the top one. If you really wanted respect, you became a minister. Because then you had a whole congregation behind you, you had money coming in every week, and you know, it was a good life. There was one other one which was a little bit more respectable than that. Education. Education. You could be an educator. So those were the only things that you could do. And it became frustrating for a lot of African Americans because think about it. You could go to Harvard University. You could go to Stanford. You came out, you couldn't be employed. You could only work for a black institution.